Welcome to the 2021 Watershed Congress. This is Tuesday, day 2 of the virtual Watershed Congress week. We are happy that you are joining us today. The Watershed Congress is organized by the Delaware Riverkeeper Network in collaboration with many other organizations. My name is Autumn and I am the Development Associate for the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I am also your moderator for this session, How Behavioral Science Can Inform Environmental Outreach and Communication. We are pleased to present our speaker for this session. Lindsay Blanton is a master's student at the University of Pennsylvania, whose work focuses on uncovering the social and psychological factors underpinning environmental actions. Welcome, Lindsay. I now turn it over to you.
Hi, hopefully everyone can see my screen. So I want to talk to you today about how we can create big wins for the environment by focusing specifically on people and their behavior. I want to touch a couple themes today that I'll mention multiple times, but I want to just kick us right off by mentioning that we use a lot of resources, time, and money on a lot of programs and campaigns that sometimes miss actually motivating an action. We often stop at knowledge and attitudes, but we need to take people all the way to behavior. Finally, behavioral science can help us use a different framework for thinking about how we can design and interact with the communities we serve. So I'm Lindsay Blanton. I studied cognitive science and psychology as an undergrad and then worked in the past 7 years on watershed outreach, which seem like they're not related. I've always loved both nature and the human mind, and I'm currently studying behavioral science to put these two together because yes, you can have your cake and eat it too. So I want to start with a quick poll, let me pull that up, about whether or not you have heard of behavioral science. Hang on, there we go. So the poll should be launching now. Are you very familiar with behavioral science? Have you heard of it, but you're not very familiar, never heard of it, or you're not sure? So I'll give about 30 seconds for people to pull in. Okay, so it looks like pretty much everyone has answered. Either that they're very familiar or have heard of it, but are not super familiar with it yet. So behavioral science, why should we care about behavioral science? Having worked in watershed outreach, I know it can be so frustrating to try to communicate with the public and really move the needle, right? So we can think about, should we yell louder? Should we use bigger font? Should we use cuter animals? Behavioral science tells us about how people behave and why, which is critical for us to consider as it relates to the environment. We are always looking to motivate action for climate change, for water pollution, for conservation, for really everything we do. And we don't always really know the best way to do that. Behavioral science doesn't have all the answers. There's no magic bullet, but it's a very powerful tool that we can start using. It generates bigger results for the environment, for the communities we serve, and for our organizations. So it's a win-win-win. So I happily introduce you to behavioral science today and hope that it sparks your curiosity, excitement, and hope for a better future. So audience, meet behavioral science meet audience. Behavioral science concepts will be woven throughout the presentation and defined, but given that this is only an hour, we really can't dive too deeply into all the different research findings and frameworks. Believe me, I tried to pack everything I could into this presentation, but for today, I'll just introduce you to behavioral science, why it's awesome, and how it can transform our processes. If you do have further questions about behavioral science, you are welcome to follow up with me, get in touch with me, and I'm happy to guide you depending on your interests and needs for more resources. So without further ado, here is an overview of the talk today. We'll go through 3 sections common pitfalls. We'll go over common things that we end up doing in our programs or communications that might not motivate action. We'll go over the behavioral approach and what's entailed, and then we'll put it together with an interactive exercise on journey mapping, thinking through what our behavior is, what the audience is, motivations and barriers, and levers to change. As a caveat, I just want to say there's so much incredible work and talent in the field and even in this Zoom room. So the idea here isn't to say, change everything you're doing, you need all new frameworks. The idea is to say there are some things that we sometimes miss or just forget to take into account, and we can learn new things to improve and enhance our work. On that note, I'd like to take a minute to reflect on either a program or campaign that you might have done that was looking to affect a specific outcome or behavior from your audience. And as a result of that campaign or program, you didn't necessarily get what you expected, or you didn't see big bumps or movement in the community. You don't have to write it in the Zoom chat. You certainly can if you want to, but just take a few minutes and jot it down. So if you've thought of a campaign or program you did to try to move people, move the needle, try to remember this example throughout the presentation today, and we're going to come back and reflect on it at the end. So now I would like you to grab your mobile device or iPad, or even just your internet browser. You can escape full screen and go use your internet browser. You can use the QR code right on the screen here and scan in. We're going to be doing an interactive exercise with a word cloud. I love the Zoom chat, but it doesn't necessarily lead to easy, scanning and reading. So we're going to work through some environmental ads, some popular environmental comms. And I want you to view each of them for maybe 10, 15 seconds. We're going to go through and use this to submit how they make you feel. So if I can get just some nods in the chat that people are able to scan this QR code, or if you're not on your phone and you're in a browser, to go to menti.com and use code 49478465. You should see a screen that looks like this, where you're ready to go and participate. Okay. Got it. So again, we're going to go through some popular environmental ads or just environmental comms. And you are using this to reflect how you feel when you see these comms. Give me 1 second. Okay. So on your screen now, you should have something that says, how do these make you feel? Okay, so we're wrapping up. This is the final ad. You're able to write more than one word here. You should have 3 little boxes to submit. You can also submit and then submit multiple times. So feel free to write in any last thoughts on how those ads made you feel. And we will go to the word cloud. Okay. So we've got worried, sad, depressed, angry, overwhelmed as some major things that are bigger because multiple people submitted them. We've got numb, indifferent, anxious, defeated, shocked, don't get it for some of the ads, horrifying, disgust. So there aren't a lot of positive words here. They made someone feel happy, and I don't know which ad it was, but someone feels happy. But generally, a lot of environmental communications leave us feeling just generally kind of emotionally overwhelmed and maybe unclear of what next step to even take. So many approaches to environmental advocacy can be really emotional. We go for shock and awe sometimes because a problem is really big or dire, and we want people to feel that the problem is dire, but they can also just be kind of vague and overwhelming. They don't necessarily push an outcome or change. They don't necessarily make someone feel, the same values that we feel. So when we get really deep into our work, we kind of lose track of what will move people, and we can resort to these kind of heavy messages that either can motivate action or can turn people away. And sometimes it's a very fine line between the two. So we're going to start the talk today to look at some common pitfalls in environmental communication where we just miss the opportunity to motivate action. So one thing is too negative, as we saw in a lot of the ads. Another I included was an EPA infographic about nutrient pollution that can be too info-based, too values-based, too big, overwhelming, or vague. I'm going to go through each of these and describe what they can make our audience think or feel, define how it connects to behavioral science research, and then provide a few interesting examples of why it doesn't work. For time's sake, I'm not going to share an example behavioral study for all 6, but I will share some, and then there will be digital resources after for you to explore in more depth if you're interested. So the first is too negative. So as we saw from that word cloud, there can be a ton of emotional overwhelm of fear, sadness, hopelessness, guilt, shame, and a fear message can be really effective, right? When there's a threat in our environment, it does prompt people to respond to a threat. But if it's too serious of a threat, it's like really overwhelming, or if we hear the threat too often, there can be 3 things that happen to turn people off or make them go numb, as someone said in the word cloud. It can lead to denial, which is I'm not at risk, this isn't going to happen to me. It can lead to defensive avoidance, which is this is too scary and I can't think about it. And reactance, which is kind of a backlash of, oh, I'm going to just ignore them. I don't like what they're saying. In behavioral science, there's this concept of negativity bias, which is that we're evolutionarily programmed to kind of pay attention to negative stimuli and dwell on negative stimuli more than positive ones. So you see over here, the brain is focused on one bad thing instead of lots of good things. So it's kind of problematic to set people up in this frame of negativity, and it can be hard to get out. One behavioral science study looked at whether or not shame or pride was more effective in motivating an action. So they put a piece of chocolate cake in front of someone and said, don't eat this cake. One they primed with shame. Think how bad you'll feel if you eat this cake. Another they primed with pride. Think how good you'll feel for resisting the cake. Which do you think was a more effective way to get people not to eat the cake? You can just type in the chat quickly. Pride. Okay, so it was indeed pride. So in this study, actually people who were told nothing at all ate less cake than the people who were primed with shame. The people who were primed with shame ate a lot more cake. It just does not make people feel good and motivated to act. Too information-based, we see this all the time. There's an expectation that what we want to talk about is something that people want to learn more about. And so we end up going too in depth and include way too much. And then we can even leave out what the next step is at all. We just give people a lot of information. In behavioral science, this concept is called information overload. And here's a guy who's just looking for a cookie and he has about 12 different kinds of Oreos. It's just really overwhelming. There was a study here about information on trail signs. And this slide is ironic because it is information overload in itself. But I'll draw your attention here to the key point, which is that the more messages were included on trail signs, the less information retention they had for what was on the signs. So we really want to tell people absolutely everything, but the more you try to pack in, the less they're going to remember. We can also be too value-based, highlighting specific values or identities, which can backfire. So it can lead to increased polarization. It can reach the people who already agree with you, but kind of push away people who are maybe on the line or didn't agree with you. In behavioral science, this is called the boomerang effect, which is people doing the opposite of what you intended and pushing them away, or cognitive dissonance, which is someone wanting to do something, but because you've primed this sense of their identity, it conflicts with how they feel about their identity. So here are two menus. They did a study trying to see what would prompt people to eat more vegetarian meals. So on the one control menu, they have the vegetarian meals mixed in, and on the other one, they have highlighted a separate section. Which menu do you think led to more vegetarian orders? The control menu or the vegetarian menu? Control, second, control. Okay, so we did find, not we, I didn't do this study. The vegetarian menu primes an identity. So people look at this menu and say, I'm not a vegetarian, so I don't look at that section. Whereas the control menu, the focus is more on how delicious the dish is. So I might read about the ricotta and spinach ravioli and read the description and say, that sounds great, and just order that. And there's a small V next to it. Whereas this separates them out and can lead to people just not considering that it's for them. The next is too big. The issue is much larger than the individual can feel like they have any significant effect on, which can lead to despair. This term is called self-efficacy, which is people's belief that they can accomplish or execute on a goal. The next is too overwhelming. So we can tell someone to do something, but sometimes we forget because we're so close to it, or we already are so, familiar with how to do it, that we don't realize that that action actually requires that you have a certain skill or tool to be able to do something, or it's very taxing to start doing that thing. So it can be challenging and leads to procrastination because it wasn't easy to do that thing. This is called mental scarcity or cognitive overload, which is just depleted mental bandwidth. The last is too vague. So we saw this a lot in the ads we just looked at. There's really no next step. You've given me something, maybe I care a lot, or maybe I even know about the issue, but I don't know what you want me to do now. Or alternatively, you may have given me a lot of next steps, here are 10 things you can do for water quality, and I don't know what to do next, and people really don't like to do homework. This is called ambiguity aversion, which is the tendency to just avoid anything that's unknown. So I apologize for kind of breaking my own advice, which is giving you a ton of information. So now we all have information overload. The main point here is all of these pitfalls in different ways set up some kind of difficulty or barrier for people to meet your call to action. So they can be turned away. So ideally, we want people to want to act. They need to be motivated. They need to believe that they can take the action. It needs to be feasible. And they need to know exactly what they're supposed to do. So I have another poll of all of these different pitfalls. Which do you see as being, hold on, let me move to the next one. Which do you see as being the most common, or what do you see the most often in the environmental field? It's really hard to pick just one. They are all everywhere. But which do you think seems most common? Give a few more seconds to let all the results roll in. Okay. So it looks like most people said too negative, too info-based, and too overwhelming, which is good because the too vague and too big are, I mean, they're easy to tackle, but I guess a lot of our more local problems aren't necessarily leading to despair. So that is a good thing. So instead of doing these things, what should we do instead? We should aim to be positive. Sorry, my screen is blocked. Be brief, be inclusive, be empowering, be helpful, and clear. Next, we'll discuss the value of the behavioral approach and what that entails in a broad sense. So as we just saw, a lot of communications focus on providing enough info and motivation and changing attitudes. But like we said, we want people to, know what to do, which entails a behavior. We shouldn't really stop at knowledge and attitudes. When people finally care or are finally knowledgeable about water quality, is that where we say, okay, great, we accomplished our big goal, let's pack up and go home? No way, that is not the end goal. We obviously need a specific action done once someone knows about water quality or cares about water quality. So environmental challenges are really about behavior. They're behavioral challenges at their core. What do we need people to do to protect, support, or repair the environmental problems we face? We really need to tell them what they need to do. So my call to action to you is to hold a behavior in mind and really think critically about helping people accomplish that behavior. So we've touched a little bit already on behavioral science concepts in the first section. In a nutshell, behavioral science, which is also sometimes referred to as behavioral economics, is the study of human behavior as it relates to thoughts, decisions, interactions with other people, and their actions, which really kind of touches everything. But what even causes behavior? How can we aim to pick something so complicated apart, and how do we know when it's not working? So really, before anyone would do a behavior, they have to intend to do the behavior. So maybe what causes behavior is the intention to do it. What makes someone feel like they are going to do something or want to do something? So we talked a lot about this, of what we normally focus on, someone's attitudes or knowledge or the social norms around something. Identity, culture, and demographics can influence your intentions. But can you think of a time where you meant to or wanted to do something but didn't do it? What happened? Why not? This happens all the time, and we don't often consider what gets in the way of wanting to do something and doing it. There are other barriers to behavior, like skills and abilities, and environmental and social constraints. So we're often focusing so much on knowledge and attitudes that we miss these other barriers. So there's this gap between intention and action, and there are these things that are kind of inhibiting people from getting over to the behavior they want to do. And we need to focus on understanding what the barriers are and removing them for our audience. So I want to focus on what the behavioral approach really means. I know we're focusing a lot on centering equity in our work across the field. And behavioral science can be a really excellent framework for centering equity. It's important to create communications and programs with your community instead of in a bubble trying to create these programs for your community. The behavioral approach is about finding people where they are. It's about really hearing them and centering them in the solution to a problem you're trying to solve. And it's about perspective taking and empathizing. So really understanding the structures and frameworks of your community. It's evidence-based. We're not just guessing or trying to be creative and hoping our program or campaign works. We're really gathering the information about how things work and how people feel in reality. We're using that to inform our approach and checking what's working and what's not. And it's about being humble. Behavior is very complicated. People are very complicated, as we've seen repeatedly during the pandemic. You can try your best and gather insights and feedback on what you're delivering, what's working and what's not, and making tweaks. It's collaborative and iterative, and you'll get closer to seeing change every time you iterate. Next, we're going to pull some of these ideas together, working through the behavior-centered approach and getting tools to work through the process. So as we talked about, a critical piece of the behavior approach is focusing on people, gathering evidence. You need to know what the program should look like and why it's needed and why it's the right approach. So you're gathering insight and input. So you need to talk to people. You need to talk to your audience. It doesn't have to be in depth. You don't need to do crazy research, whether it's a survey or focus group, or just getting really informal, feedback and chats and phone calls. You need to make an effort to gather more insights and input before you start narrowing the scope of your project. You never know what great idea or angle you'll be missing by not actually talking to your audience. People share all kinds of personal insights here, so it's important to listen for the gaps between the intention and the action. Where are they coming up short? Why is the behavior difficult to do? What are they missing? Try not to hold on to your own lens of what you already know about the problem or what your values are. Your why is not going to be their why. Once you've talked to people and gathered a lot of insight, it can be hard to make sense of all these different little interviews and snippets of information. So I highly recommend a journey map. This is kind of a mock-up of what a journey map is at its basic level. You want to look at a goal behavior and break down the small steps in between to accomplish that behavior. And then in each step, you need to ask your audience, what is required to do this? What might help or hinder you at each of these steps? And how does it feel to be in that step? So I'd love to pull you in and have you be my community to do a group exercise and journey map on using reusable bags. So we will work through the example behavior with me designing a campaign, reaching out to you, potential bag users in the community to work through some of the barriers here. So I am going to move over to our journey map. Okay, this looks like a lot, I know, but it's the same as in our mock-up. I'm using Miro, which I highly recommend. It has free templates for journey maps. Essentially, we would start, I'll zoom in here. We would start by looking at, who is this for? This is for a person using a reusable shopping bag. And I clarify it applies to any bag or container for grocery shopping or other shopping. You can think about what the key goals and needs might be or what the key struggles are, or you can decide to fill that in at the end. I've already filled in, sorry, it's zoomed in so you can see it, but it's hard to navigate when it's so zoomed in. I filled in some of the steps already just for time's sake. People can first purchase a bag. They need to have the bag ready to use. They need to bring the bag into the store. They need to remember to use it at the register. And then they need to be ready to return that bag back to be used again. So you'll see here, the first column here is breaking down what exactly is necessary to do this step. So I've thought through, what actions need to be done to purchase a bag. I need to know where to buy one and what type I should buy. You need to have the bag ready to use. Either it needs to be in your car or purse or backpack, whatever you're traveling around with. You need to bring it into the store. So that means grabbing the bags and carrying them into the shop. To use at the register, you need to tell the cashier you want to use your bags, or they might just start putting them in plastic bags. And you need to bring your bags out at checkout. And then you need to unload your items from the bag and return the bag to, wherever you're going to use it again. What I need help with here from you in the chat is understanding the pain points here. So as a potential bag user, you might, like me, have the intention to use your reusable bag all the time, but there's that gap between your intention and actually doing it. So if you were my audience, I would be asking you, what comes up when you're at the store? Why might you forget to use your bag or, it doesn't end up happening? So if you could all use your chat to type in different barriers you encounter as a user in either purchasing, having the bag ready to go, pulling it into the store, remembering to use it at the register, and returning it. Okay, so I'm going to start popping these into the model. Oops. So is the bag big? Is it the size I need? So that might be an issue when you're purchasing, kind of knowing what to buy and making sure that it's going to be useful for you. Another is, how can I change my habit? Used it last time. You leave it in the car. Is it easy to carry? So I'm going to say for purchasing the bag, you really need to know that it's going to be useful to you. So I'm going to put it under barriers to kind of knowing that you have the right thing. So right size, easy to carry. You could do this for so many different audiences as well. I want to highlight that everyone is going to encounter different barriers. So you may find as you talk to different people that you need to segment your audience and notice, okay, these kinds of people in this town, if it's a more complex behavior, say about water quality, are encountering this kind of barrier, and that's not encountered over in this other town. So you can start to tease apart, where you're seeing different roadblocks. Another is, I'm always forgetting the bag. Does the checkout person ask if I want to use them? So this is something that always happens to me. I might even have my bag in my purse, but I just forget to tell someone that I want to use my bags, or they don't prompt me to use the bags. And then everything gets bagged up in plastic and I feel bad telling them to unpack it. So no prompt. Not bringing the right number of bags. This is a good one. So some stuff might get bagged into plastic anyway. I'm going to put this at the checkout stage. Not enough bags. Always forget the bag. So this is a main one of, you have it in your car and you did all the work to buy it and it's ready to go, but you just forgot it in the car. So as you see, there are all of these different things as you zoom out of, we just wanted to do a campaign for people to start using reusable bags. But when you really start empathizing in with the audience, you can think about oh, well, how does it feel to be in this state of, trying to remember to bring a bag, or knowing what kind of bag I need, or knowing how many I'll need for my groceries? There can be so many barriers for people to take the action we want to take, especially as it gets more abstract about things that aren't so clear as a reusable bag. This process can help you funnel everything you're hearing from your audience into, where can I help? What should we intervene on? Where does there need to be additional resource? So finding all of these, barriers at different stages in the process can help you really hone in on how to use your resources and time. So I won't belabor this too much longer. The only thing I want to mention is that this is not just about finding barriers. You can also identify lots of things that are motivating or helpful for people at each step that might already exist. So the little green sticky notes in each step might be, things that people say that are positive about, maybe, there's already, a reminder that their township sends out about such and such, and you can fill those in. Down here in this particular template, you can redesign it any way you want. But from all of these insights, another key step is to figure out, well, where do they interact with me? Where do they interact with my organization or the township? And find places in each step of taking this behavior where you might have a touch point to be able to help someone lower one of these barriers. So it's really just about talking to people and then sorting and analyzing the insights that you got so you can design the right program or the right campaign. So I will switch back to the PowerPoint. So essentially, we saw all of these different things that came up in just the normal ask of asking people to use reusable bags. There are all of these barriers that block people from doing what they need to do, even if they really want to. So I want to talk about barriers. Again, there are also motivators and things that help people do things, but for this purpose, I want to really focus in on barriers that we often forget to think about. So forgetfulness, we mentioned this, that people just don't remember to bring the bag in. Fear of change, it might be that I really like getting the paper bags that they give me at the grocery store because I use them for my recycling, so I don't really want to change. There might be an issue of trust of who's sending the message and having the right messenger for me to, want to come along with your campaign. There might be an identity conflict, which we mentioned earlier, is that's kind of boomerang effect or cognitive dissonance of, I want to do this, but it's not really aligned with who I see myself being. And mental scarcity, like, I'm just so crazy, there's so much going on, I cannot remember to bring my bags. It's too much. Then there are all kinds of external barriers. So I want to highlight that external barriers are things that we often miss, which is where a lot of these systemic inequalities can show up in our communities. So being mindful of exploring how different audiences may have very different experiences and feelings and challenges trying to do the exact same behavior. So some people might have lack of access. Some people might have lack of skill to do what you're asking them. They might have no infrastructure, or it's an unclear system, something like it being really unclear how I'm supposed to, where I'm supposed to get a bag. I'm not even sure how to start. So all of these things can be societal or environmental setups that aren't that the person, doesn't want to do it, but it's just challenging or not possible. So when we've worked through all of this information we've given people, we want to help people get over the barrier by lowering the barrier, making it a little bit easier, or just removing the barrier for people completely so they can succeed in reaching the goal. It can be complicated, as we saw. There are all these different steps and there are all these different behaviors that come up. Is it that you need to help people, remember to bring it in, or bring it back to their car, or purchase them? There are lots of different things to consider. So I want to highlight the fact that you could use a matrix of how challenging the behavior is and how effective it will be to like getting to your goal. It should be feasible for your organization to do. Don't set yourself up to fail. And you can certainly tackle more than one thing at once, just don't make it too complicated or confusing. If something is very effortful and not that effective, don't do it. It's awesome and a low-hanging fruit if something requires little or no effort and is very effective. Go for it. Anything else in these quadrants will just be a sliding scale of how hard it is and how effective it's going to be. So maybe it is, the bang is worth the buck to do something hard that's going to be very effective. On choosing an audience, some of the similar considerations are who's going to be easiest to move and who's going to be most impactful if their behavior changes. You can tackle multiple audiences together, but think about whether or not their needs and motivations and barriers complement each other. You don't want to have a lot of conflicting comms out there where, you know, this is for one audience and this is for another and they say totally different things. It's nice to do a campaign or program where you're definitely tackling multiple audiences, but they're pretty similar in what they need from you, so you can kind of lump them together. This is a critical slide. It's a little boring, but critical. This is a framework from RARE, which is an organization that focuses specifically on environmental behavior change. And it lists different levers to actually move behavior. So it's like, how are you going to get that done? You've figured out what you want people to do. You figured out who you need to do it. Now, how are you going to use that information to design your program or campaign? So the wheel lists different ways. For incentives, for example, incentives are just increasing or decreasing the easiness of something in terms of cost or time or effort. So for bags, if people indicated that they have trouble affording bags, perhaps part of your program or campaign would be to provide free bags. If people indicate for social influences that they don't really see anyone using the bags and they feel alone or they feel strange using bags, maybe you want to highlight or create a norm where it's more salient that everyone's using bags. So you could say like Ambler uses reusable bags, or just increase visibility of bag use. For information, this may be if people are just unsure. They just need a little more information that will help them justify, you know, taking on that behavior. So if people see unsure of why to use a reusable bag, you can go ahead and give them information that they need to help them get why it's a good thing to do. There are so many examples of emotional appeals, which is just using emotion instead of, you know, information. Think back to the images we saw at the beginning about plastic in our oceans harming wildlife. Next is rules and regulations to promote the behavior. Perfect example of this is a bag tax, which is increasingly used in many different cities. And lastly, choice architecture. This is one that is usually a new term for people, and it essentially means changing the context in which you're making the decision. So it can mean a prompt or reminder, or making something a default option, just kind of changing the landscape where people are deciding. So if people indicate that forgetting their bag in the car is the biggest issue they run into, then a great intervention or campaign here could be putting a big sign in the parking lot by where you return your car that says, "Don't forget your bag." So people have a prompt, you know, timely reminder that they can go back to their car and grab their bag. And then it's easy as that. Now they have their bag in the store. Lastly, I don't want to have such a teaser where, you know, there's all of this behavioral science research on what really works for environmental change. So there is so much study that backs up a lot of, you know, what does and doesn't work for policy and campaigns. So I can definitely provide more resources if people are interested. But some overarching themes are, it's good to make it fun and easy. People don't want to feel like it's a downer. They don't want to be thinking about climate despair. It's easy to, you know, take an action that makes you feel good. Don't tell people what not to do. Try to tell people what you want them to do. That's easier and more clear. Highlight ways that the action will benefit them personally. Not everyone shares our values. Your why isn't their why. But if there's a personal benefit, like using bags saves me money from the new bag tax, then highlight that. And lastly, reminders, perks, and social signaling are really powerful. So by all means, try to think of where you can just help people along and lower those barriers. Be really, really specific. So reduce plastic pollution is kind of vague, as we saw from the earlier, doesn't work. Don't use plastic bags. That's a negative framing. Go green, go reusable. That primes an identity that might turn me away. Lastly, you could just say, remember to use your reusable bag every time you shop. It's positive. It tells me exactly what I'm supposed to do. I know my next step. Here are some great campaigns that do use all of those things. This just says save paper. So I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. And it kind of has an emotional visual appeal where every time I use more paper towels, I see more of, the rainforest being depleted. So really effective. Lights Out Philly. I couldn't find a bigger picture. This is like from Instagram or something, but Lights Out Philly is clear. It's telling me what to do, turn my lights out. It's telling me who I'm in Philly. It's telling me what dates and what times. It's not asking me if I care about birds. It's not trying to give me any information or affect my, tug on my heartstrings. It's just saying lights out. Great. So if you want to use your phone again, scan back into Menti or go to menti.com. I'd love to hear a reflection back on your example of what you're doing in your work and how using behavioral science or some of these tips might be helpful to you in thinking about next steps you might consider or what you might incorporate into your project. So if you scan in or go to menti.com or still have it up on your phone, you can type in and submit what you would like to do in the future. What might help you? What are your next steps? Didn't have time for breakout rooms here, though I would have loved to kind of discuss, but you can see what everyone else is thinking of. So things you might incorporate or what your next steps are on your project. Awesome. These are all great. I will share some kind of digital resource because I know this is like a lot and it'd be awesome to have a cheat sheet of do's and don'ts and how to go through this process. So I'll absolutely share that with you after the presentation. Awesome. So as a wrap up in review before Q&A, remember to think about behaviors, not just attitudes, values, and knowledge. Ask yourself what action, which audience, why aren't they already doing something? Really ask. And what motivates them and how can your design address that? Strive to be positive, brief, inclusive, empowering, helpful, and clear. Use a journey map to break down what's involved in doing the behavior you're asking them to do. Really put yourself in their shoes and figure out how you would do it and identify what the barriers and motivators are for people. Talk to the audience, don't just guess. So if you want takeaways, if you want something easy, just change your calls to action, make them clear and motivating and positive. If you want a challenge, start soliciting feedback from your audience before, during, and after the project. And if you want a next level challenge, start to use the behavioral approach in designing your comms and new projects. Really make it collaborative with your community, see what they need, and wisely use your resources and time designing around how to get people there based on what they need. If you're interested in behavioral science, you can quickly screenshot this, or it'll be available later. Some recommended books, really great podcasts, and websites if you want to read some short articles. Also, I want to plug, this is how I first heard of behavioral science. Brooke Tully is someone who used to work at RARE, which is the organization that does environmental behavior change. She's now a consultant, and she does 8-week online courses because people can't pay for consultants, but they can incorporate this knowledge into their own work. So teaching people on a deeper level the processes of designing for behavior change, and it's specifically about the environmental field. So if you go to brooketully.com, she has a course that's starting at the end of the month, and I highly recommend it. And remember, everything is BS, behavioral science. Thank you so much, and I will now do Q&A. So I'll pull up the chat. People love Brooke Tully. I love Brooke Tully too. Okay, so if there are any questions.
If you go down and click on the box that says specifically Q&A, you've got a series of about 6 questions that people ask. We've got 5 minutes. You probably can do 1 or 2.
Okay, awesome. I've heard that what is actually the fossil fuel I've heard that is what the fossil fuel industry came up with and promoted individual carbon footprint idea. Yes, I've heard that too. So diverting attention away from fossil fuel industries and making the individual feel like they need to take a personal step instead of the burden being on the fossil fuel industry, which has a much bigger effect. Why did that work from a behavioral science perspective? That is a super loaded question, and I'm very interested in that kind of like, it's called locus of control in behavioral science, which is like who has the power to do something, who is, you know, the mover. Absolutely, the fossil fuel industry, you know, puts it on their customer and consumer in general, which is, you know, plastic straws and plastic bags and all of the, like we as individuals can do everything we possibly can, but it's certainly not going to have the big impact that the big movers will have. Why that works? Honestly, just if you're like people don't like to do a lot of extra homework. If you just imagine all people to be like kind of lazy and having a limited attention span and limited cognitive like capacity, especially with everything that flies around us now on social media, the messages that you give people really stick. So if I see over and over and over again, you know, messaging about like, you can do, or like do your part, or, you know, it's about what the individual is doing, like decline plastic straws. People won't necessarily do a lot of deeper thinking on, oh, well, that's not really the main point. Not everyone is going to kind of take that thought journey. So it works just because, you know, they're putting that message in front of you, and most people take stuff at face value and will just kind of assimilate those messages. Oops. Next question. A lot of times we think about needing motivation first to drive action. Are there any studies that support the reverse, that action first is more effective? That is a really good question. There's probably a research paper on anything you could imagine. I highly encourage you to go to like Google Scholar just for fun and start typing in different things like sustainability, you know, intention, action gap, and you'll just get a billion things. What's frustrating about behavioral science is one study can say one thing, and as we know, like someone else doesn't necessarily confirm that. So there aren't, I would say the main thing to know about behavioral science is that context is critical. Each audience has something different that will work for them, which is annoying, but also empowering, because it's like, you're not going to miss out on some key piece of research you didn't read. You really just need to plug into your community. So there may be instances where like getting the action done first is better, and they don't necessarily need to have this like inner drive to do it. That's where a lot of the choice architecture or like personal benefit comes in. You don't need to have someone be motivated or like care about climate change. You can find so many other ways to get someone to do a behavior that has nothing to do with that. So if your particular audience maybe doesn't have motivation or care about the thing you want them to care about, maybe don't try to hit your head against a wall trying to get them to share it. Look at what they do care about and motivate the action through that. And don't try to cultivate motivation. It might come later. And it is 2 o'clock, so I will stop.
All right. Thank you so much. I am afraid it is time to wrap up our session, but I wanted to thank Lindsay once again for taking the time to share her knowledge with us during this week of the Watershed Congress presentations. Have a great afternoon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.